All right, get ready because we're diving deep into some seriously thought-provoking stuff today. We're tackling Aristotle's On the Heavens.
Oh, yeah, a classic.
It is, and we're going way beyond just summarizing it. We're uncovering why this text was such a big deal for like centuries. And who knows, maybe we'll have a few aha moments of our own along the way, right?
Absolutely. I mean, think about it. Aristotle, using just his observations and his brain power, built a whole system to explain the universe. It's like, wow, the power of human curiosity.
No kidding. And one thing that really jumps out is how he tackles the idea of the universe being a finite sphere. Not infinite, which is what some other philosophers back then were saying. I mean, how did he even get there?
Well, he's got this completeness argument. Basically, he says we humans, we can only really wrap our heads around three dimensions, length, width, height. Anything beyond that, forget it. It's beyond us.
Okay, so he's saying there's got to be a limit to existence as we know it. That's kind of wild.
It is. And within this finite sphere, he's got this hierarchy, right? Earth smack dab in the center. Then these layers of the other elements.
Okay, so picture it. Earth is the bullseye, and around it you've got water, then air, then fire, like a cosmic onion, kind of, and then boom, the outermost layer, the celestial sphere, with all those stars and planets.
You got it. But these layers, they weren't just random. Aristotle believed each element had its own inherent nature that determined its place in the grand scheme of things. So Earth, heavy stuff, naturally wants to be at the center.
And fire, being all light and airy, shoots upwards. So it's not just a random arrangement, it's like reflecting their essence.
Exactly. And this idea of natural tendencies, that's really the foundation of his whole model of the universe.
This is where it gets even more interesting. Aristotle, he draws this clear line between the heavens and earth. The celestial realm, eternal and unchanging, totally different from down here, where everything's in flux, always changing.
Right, he's looking at the night sky. The stars, they seem fixed in their constellations, eternally moving in these predictable paths.
But hold on, if the universe is eternal and unchanging, how did this cosmic dance even start?
That's where the prime mover steps in. This is how Aristotle brings those two ideas together. An eternal universe, but something had to get it going.
So it's like the ultimate cosmic Kickstarter.
Yeah, exactly. The prime mover is this perfect, unchanging being, and it sets everything in motion. It's the force behind the eternal circular motion of the celestial sphere.
Hold up, why is circular motion so important here?
Well, to Aristotle, circular motion, that was perfection, eternity. Totally different from the linear motion we see here on Earth, stuff going up or down.
Yeah.
That was seen as imperfect, limited.
So the stars and planets are in this eternal, graceful ballet, all thanks to the prime mover. It's a pretty poetic vision, actually.
It is. And remember that idea of natural tendencies we were talking about. That plays a role here, too. It explains why the heavy stuff, the Earth, moves down towards the center while fire reaches up, up, up.
It's all connected, like a well-oiled machine. Every element has its spot, its purpose. I mean, you got to be impressed by the sheer scope of his thinking.
Absolutely. But, no model of the universe is perfect. And as we dig deeper, we'll start to see where some of Aristotle's ideas didn't quite match up with reality.
And I bet those discrepancies become even more obvious as we get into his ideas about the elements themselves.
You're right. We've talked about the structure, the big picture. But Aristotle didn't stop there. He had a whole theory about the nature of those four elements, earth, water, air, and fire.
Right. Those layers in his model weren't just decoration. They were representing the building blocks of existence.
Exactly. And get this, he believed these elements weren't just fixed, they could actually change into each other through changes in, their fundamental qualities.
So that's where his ideas about density and rarity come into play, right? Like how water can turn into air. We call it evaporation, but to him, it was a much bigger deal.
It was. For Aristotle, it wasn't just a change of state. It was like the element itself was transforming, almost like alchemy, this idea that the basic stuff of the universe could morph and change.
Definitely makes you think about chemistry and the elements in a whole new way. But it's so cool to see how he wrestled with these questions using what he knew back then.
Absolutely. And speaking of wrestling with ideas, Aristotle wasn't afraid to disagree with other philosophers.
And one of his biggest disagreements was with the Pythagoreans and their whole harmony of the spheres thing. What was that all about?
Oh yeah, the Pythagoreans, they believed that the movements of the celestial bodies, they actually produced a kind of celestial music.
Yeah.
A harmony based on mathematical ratios.
So the universe is one big symphony?
Pretty much. But Aristotle wasn't buying it. He was like, if stars were making noise, we'd hear it. Right? He figured their silent movement was because of the frictionless celestial sphere.
So he's bringing it back down to Earth, being practical.
Exactly. And while he might not have agreed about the music, he did have his own ideas about what stars were made of. He called it either.
Either sounds kind of mystical. What made it so special to Aristotle?
Either it was considered perfect, eternal, unchanging, perfect for the celestial realm, totally different from those four earthly elements we've been talking about. Aristotle was also big on the spherical shape of stars. He thought it was the best shape for their eternal movement within that celestial sphere.
All right, so quick recap. We've got a finite spherical universe, Earth at the center, surrounded by layers of elements, each with its own natural tendency to move. The whole shebang is set in motion by the prime mover, and the stars, made of this fancy either stuff, are gliding along eternally in their circular paths.
That's Aristotle's universe in a nutshell.
But wait, there's one more big piece of his model we got to talk about. His whole stance against the idea of a plurality of worlds.
Oh yeah, he was totally against the idea of multiple universes.
Yeah.
Or even other worlds besides our own.
That's a bold claim, especially now that we're all talking about the multiverse and stuff.
It is. And to back it up, he used his theories of natural place and motion. He basically said if there was another world, things would behave differently there, which wouldn't make sense with what we see in our universe.
So he's like, if there's another world out there, things would fall up instead of down.
Exactly. For Aristotle, the whole idea of another world with different laws of nature, it just didn't compute.
It really shows how much he believed in a single, complete, finite universe.
Absolutely.
It's mind-blowing, really. Aristotle, just by observing and thinking, built this amazingly complex and detailed model of the universe.
And what's crazy is how influential it was. I mean, it shaped how people thought about the universe for centuries. Even affected religious and philosophical ideas.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. But before we go any further, let's take a look at some of the problems Aristotle's model faced, even back then.
Good point. Even in ancient Greece, not everyone agreed with him. And you know what? Some of the very things Aristotle used to support his ideas, well, they eventually led to his model being, well, not completely abandoned, but definitely changed.
Ooh, this is getting good. I can't wait to hear how this all plays out in part 2. Welcome back to our deep dive into Aristotle's On the Heavens. Last time, we were exploring his model of the universe, with Earth in the center and those layers of elements, and the prime mover making it all go round.
A really elegant system.
Yeah, it is. But like you said at the end of part 1, even back then, there were some little hints that maybe things weren't quite so perfect. What were some of those early challenges to Aristotle's model?
Well, one of the biggest ones came from those same observations that Aristotle used to build his ideas. The movements of those celestial bodies.
You mean like those perfectly circular paths, the ones that he thought were like the signature of the heavens?
Exactly. See, as astronomers got better at observing the night sky, they started to notice that those planets, they don't actually move in perfect circles like Aristotle thought. It's a bit more, well, messy.
Oh, so what were they seeing that didn't fit with Aristotle's model?
Imagine this. You're watching a planet, right? And instead of just cruising along in a circle, it slows down, stops, and then starts moving backward for a while. It's like it's doing a loop-de-loop in space.
That's definitely not a simple circle. Did they have a name for that weird movement?
Yeah, they called it retrograde motion. And it was a real head-scratcher for anyone trying to make it fit with Aristotle's Earth-centered universe. I mean, if everything revolves around Earth in perfect circles, how come some planets seem to be doing a U-turn?
Yeah, that's a good question. So how did they try to explain that while still keeping Aristotle's model intact?
They came up with some pretty clever but kind of complicated explanations. One idea was this thing called epicycles.
Epicycles, what are those?
Imagine this. Instead of the planet just orbiting the Earth in one big circle, it's actually on this smaller circle, an epicycle. And the center of that epicycle is moving along the bigger circle around Earth.
So like a circle moving on another circle? Sounds tricky.
It was. But if you fiddled with the size and speed of those epicycles just right, you could kind of make it match up with how those planets seem to be moving backward. It was like patching up Aristotle's model with duct tape.
It sounds like they were really going to great lengths to keep Earth at the center of everything.
Oh yeah, for sure. But as time went on and their observations got even more precise, all those epicycles upon epicycles started getting really, really messy. It was harder and harder to make it all work.
So the cracks were starting to show, huh? Feels like a big change is coming.
You got it. And that's where this revolutionary astronomer, Copernicus, comes in. In the 16th century, he throws out this radical idea. What if, instead of the Earth, the sun was at the center of the universe?
Whoa, that's like flipping Aristotle's model upside down.
It was.
You,
Copernicus called it the heliocentric model, with the
Ah.
sun in the center and all the planets, including Earth, going around it. And this model actually made that whole retrograde motion thing a lot easier to explain.
Okay, I'm intrigued. How does having the sun in the center explain those planets seemingly moving backward?
Think about it this way. Imagine you're at a track race, running faster than the person next to you. As you pass them, it looks like they're moving backward, even though they're still running forward. It's just because you're moving faster.
I get it. So because Earth is moving faster than some of the outer planets, it would look like those planets were going backwards sometimes, even though they're actually still orbiting the sun in the same direction.
Exactly. Copernicus's model explained retrograde motion as just an optical illusion, just because of how Earth is moving around the sun.
That's so smart. But I bet it was a pretty big shock for people back then to have their whole view of the universe turned upside down like that.
Oh yeah, totally. Copernicus's heliocentric model was like shaking the foundations of everything they thought they knew about the universe. After all, Aristotle's ideas had been around for almost 2,000 years.
So how did people react to this radical new idea? Were they immediately like, yep, Copernicus, you're right?
Not quite. It took a while for people to warm up to Copernicus's ideas. He got some pushback, not just from the church, who were really attached to the Earth-centered view, but even from some astronomers who weren't ready to ditch Aristotle just yet.
It makes sense, I guess. It's hard to let go of an idea that you've believed in for so long.
Yeah, for sure. But over time, more and more evidence came out that supported Copernicus's model. And then the telescope was invented in the early 1600s, and that was a real game changer.
Ah, yes, Galileo and his telescope. That was a big moment in astronomy.
Totally. Galileo used his telescope to make all sorts of discoveries that just didn't fit with Aristotle's ideas. For instance, he saw that Jupiter had its own moons orbiting around it.
Wow. That's like a mini solar system right there.
Yeah.
It totally blows up the idea that everything in the universe revolves around Earth.
It does. And that wasn't all. Galileo also observed the phases of Venus, just like the moon goes through phases. And that was more evidence for a sun-centered system.
Okay, so we've got Copernicus with his heliocentric model, and then Galileo with his telescope backing it up. Sounds like Aristotle's model is in trouble.
It was. And then there's Johannes Kepler, another brilliant astronomer and mathematician who was working around the same time as Galileo.
What did Kepler bring to the table?
Well, Kepler took Copernicus's model and made it even better. He really dove deep into how planets move, especially Mars, and he figured out that their orbits weren't perfectly circular like everyone had thought, even Copernicus.
Oh, so what shape were they then?
Ellipses. They're like stretched out circles, ovals, basically. And Kepler figured out that the sun was at one of those special points in the ellipse called a focus. This was a huge discovery. It's actually called Kepler's first law of planetary motion. And it showed that even in space, things weren't always about perfect circles.
Wow, so even Copernicus, who had this revolutionary idea about the sun being in the center, was still kind of stuck on that old idea of perfect circles. It took Kepler to really figure it out.
Exactly. And Kepler didn't stop there. He came up with two more laws of planetary motion, and together with his elliptical orbits, they could predict how planets move through space incredibly accurately.
So with Copernicus, Galileo, and Kepler, we're seeing a complete change in how people understand the universe. The Earth-centered model is out, and the sun-centered one is in, and those perfect circles, they're out too.
Right. And all of this led to the biggest name in this whole scientific revolution, Isaac Newton.
Newton. Gravity, the apple, the whole deal. What did Newton do with all these ideas?
Well, in the late 17th century, Newton comes up with his laws of motion and universal gravitation. And this was a totally new way of understanding how stuff moves, whether it's here on Earth or out in space.
So no more prime mover, no more natural places for the elements.
Not exactly like Aristotle thought about them, no. Newton showed that gravity is this force that acts on everything that has mass, pulling things towards each other. So why apples fall from trees, why the moon goes around the Earth, why planets orbit the sun, it's all because of gravity.
So thanks to Newton, we have this new way of understanding why things move the way they do. And these laws, they apply everywhere, not just on Earth.
Exactly. Newton's work was truly revolutionary. He explained things that were happening both in the sky and here on Earth. Aristotle, with his separate ideas for the heavens and Earth, could only have dreamed of something like that.
It's pretty amazing how far we've come from Aristotle's finite, Earth-centered universe to this huge, dynamic cosmos that's all about gravity. But even though Aristotle's model isn't accurate anymore, I bet he still had a big impact on science, right?
You're totally right. Even though many of his ideas have been, well, proven wrong, his influence on science is huge. I mean, he was all about observation, logical thinking, and trying to find natural explanations for things. Those are the very foundations of science. We'll talk more about his lasting legacy in the next part of our deep dive.
Can't wait. See you then. And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into Aristotle's On the Heavens. We've gone from his model of the universe, all elegant and thought out, to seeing how later discoveries, well, kind of changed things. What a journey.
It really has been. From a universe that was finite with Earth in the center
Yeah.
to this massive, ever-changing cosmos where gravity is king. It's amazing how our understanding has evolved.
It is. But you know what's really interesting to me? Even though Aristotle's model isn't quite right, his ideas stuck around for a really long time. What made them so influential, even for centuries after he was gone?
That's a great question. Aristotle's impact on, Western thought is seriously huge. It wasn't just science. His ideas showed up in philosophy and religion, too.
So even though his model had some problems, people still held on to his ideas. Why do you think that was?
Well, a few reasons, I think.
Mhm.
First of all, remember how we were talking about how logical and organized Aristotle was?
Huh.
He built this complete system, like a puzzle, where his observations and theories and even his philosophical ideas, they all fit together.
Yeah, it was a really impressive system, even if some of the pieces weren't in the right place.
Exactly. It just made sense to people, especially back then when they didn't have as much knowledge as we do now. Plus, his work had this kind of intellectual appeal that really resonated with thinkers for generations. And another thing, Aristotle's ideas, they got picked up by the Catholic Church, which was super powerful in the Middle Ages.
So his cosmology, it basically became part of religious teachings, which would made it even more influential, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely. People like Thomas Aquinas, they saw Aristotle's philosophy as, compatible with Christian theology. They used his concept of the prime mover, for example, to understand God's role in creating the universe.
It's interesting how Aristotle's ideas, which started out as scientific theories, ended up having such a big impact on religious thought.
It really is. And it wasn't just the church either. Aristotle's works were super popular with Islamic scholars, too. They translated his writings and kept them safe, which helped spread his ideas even further.
So his influence went way beyond ancient Greece, crossing cultures and centuries. Amazing how his ideas traveled and took root in all these different places.
It is. And even in astronomy, his ideas had staying power. Remember Ptolemy, the astronomer from the 2nd century AD? He came up with a geocentric model, still with Earth at the center, but he tweaked it a bit to try to explain those weird planetary movements we were talking
Oh
about.
yeah, those epicycles and all that. So Ptolemy was trying to update Aristotle's model so that it actually matched what astronomers were seeing.
Exactly. And even though Ptolemy's model still had Earth at the center, it was actually pretty good at predicting where planets would be in the sky. In fact, his model was the main one that people used for over 1,400 years.
Wow. So even though Aristotle's original model had some flaws, it really laid the groundwork for other astronomers to build on and improve.
It did. And here's something else that's kind of cool to think about. Aristotle, he was all about observing the world and using logic, right? And in a way, that's what led to people eventually questioning and revising his model.
That's kind of ironic, isn't it? How did his ideas lead to their own downfall?
Well, because he emphasized looking at the evidence and thinking critically, that helped create this tradition of scientific inquiry. And that's what eventually led to people realizing that maybe his model wasn't completely accurate.
It's almost like he unknowingly set the stage for his own ideas to be challenged and improved upon.
Exactly. As astronomers got better tools and made more precise observations, they started to see things that didn't quite fit with Aristotle's model. And that led to people questioning old assumptions, which eventually led to those big changes, like the Copernican revolution and the birth of modern astronomy.
It just goes to show you that science isn't about being right all the time. It's about always searching for knowledge, testing ideas, and being open to changing your mind when new evidence comes along. And Aristotle, even though his model wasn't perfect, he played a big role in setting that scientific spirit in motion.
Absolutely. And think about our understanding of the universe now, even though it's so different from Aristotle's, it's still built on that foundation of scientific inquiry that he helped establish. His legacy is still with us as we keep exploring the universe and trying to figure it all out.
It's pretty amazing to think that we're all part of this huge, ongoing journey of discovery that started with people like Aristotle, who looked up at the stars and wondered, what is all of this?
And who knows, maybe hundreds of years from now, people will look back at our current models of the universe and think, wow, they had it all wrong. But it's that curiosity, that desire to understand that keeps us moving forward.
So well said. As we wrap up our deep dive into Aristotle's On the Heavens, let's take a minute to appreciate how powerful ideas can be, how important it is to question what we think we know, and how our understanding of the universe is always changing.
And let's not forget, even though our maps of the universe might change, the real adventure is in the journey itself, in that quest to explore and make sense of the cosmos.
Thanks for joining us on this awesome journey through time and ideas. Until next time, stay curious and keep on exploring.